Imagine a world where winters were more than just a season. They were a fight for survival, a time when the cold could be a death sentence and the warmth of your home meant the difference between life and death. Medieval peasants, often living in simple stone cottages or wooden huts, had to rely on resourcefulness and ingenuity to stay alive as brutal winters claimed the lives of many. They didn't have the luxury of central heating, electric blankets, or warm fireside chats. But what they did have was an intimate understanding of the world around them, of the materials, methods, and even the weather. With an incredible connection to the land, they developed some ingenious survival techniques to stay warm during the bitter, unrelenting winters. These were not just about comfort, they were about survival. In a time when the average medieval peasant lived on the brink, a cold winter could mean more than frostbite. It could mean the end of your family, your crops, your livelihood. Survival depended not just on the food you had stored, but on how well you could keep the cold at bay. While wealthy landowners could afford to escape the worst of the chill in their grand castles with luxurious tapestries, well-stocked fireplaces, and servant-stoked hearths, peasants didn't have those comforts. Yet, in the face of adversity, they developed brilliant ways to survive even the deadliest of winters. It was the difference between enduring another season or not making it to the next. The first key to the medieval peasants' winter survival was their use of the very homes they lived in. At first glance, the low stone structures with thatched roofs may seem humble, even drafty, but these small houses were designed with great attention to warmth and efficiency. One of the most ingenious methods was a little-known technique involving the building of homes with earth floors. Though not the most glamorous approach, the earth beneath their feet helped trap warmth. Unlike wooden or stone floors, earth naturally absorbed heat, radiating it slowly through the room. The heat from the fires, however small, would keep the ground warm, creating a more stable and tolerable climate within the household. Peasants knew that staying warm wasn't just about having a large fire, it was about retaining and maintaining the warmth as efficiently as possible. They also built their homes with thick walls, stone, timber, and clay, and strategically designed them to trap heat. This was achieved by leaving narrow windows and small openings, which helped limit the amount of heat lost. The small windows weren't just about keeping the cold out, they were carefully positioned to let in as much sunlight as possible during the daylight hours, thus allowing them to maximize the natural warmth provided by the sun. By keeping windows small, they also prevented the winds from sneaking in, which could easily lower the temperature in the house to dangerous levels. In these was an art form, often in the center of the room. The placement of the fire was an art form, often in the center of the room, surrounded by stone or brick to reflect the warmth back into the living space. The homes weren't just made for the cold, they were built to fight back against it, but the fire wasn't always enough to hold the chill at bay, especially during the most extreme conditions. It was during these particularly cruel winters that peasants used something truly remarkable, the bedding fire. This technique involved carefully layering the bedding with hot stones or heated bricks. These stones were often taken directly from the hearth and placed in the bedding before the peasants went to sleep. The stones provided warmth throughout the night, and as they gradually lost heat, they would warm the blankets and keep the body temperature stable. The fire might be dying, but the warmth stayed, allowing them to survive those long, freezing nights. This practice also helped conserve firewood, something that was precious and not to be wasted, especially when resources were limited. With this method, peasants could sleep through the night without the constant need to stoke a fire. And that's not all. During the coldest months, many peasants would gather in shared spaces to create a sort of communal warmth. The idea was simple. By grouping together, you could share body heat and protect each other from the relentless cold. This often meant that entire families, along with their livestock, would huddle together in a single room, sometimes even sleeping next to their animals for warmth. This arrangement was far from ideal, but was often the best available option in a world where survival was paramount. The animals, particularly cattle, were naturally warmer, and their presence provided both physical and psychological comfort. Imagine trying to sleep in a room full of bodies and animals. But the sense of security it offered was invaluable. As uncomfortable as it was an effective way to get through the night. Another technique that helped medieval peasants survive the cold was their use of insulation made from natural materials. They didn't have synthetic blankets or insulation made from foam or plastic, but they had access to a range of natural resources that could be used to trap heat. Thick woolen blankets, often handmade, were a staple in every peasant home. Wool, known for its ability to retain heat even when wet, was a lifesaver during the long winters. But wool wasn't the only resource used to insulate their homes. They would also stuff the gaps in their walls and around their windows with straw, moss, and even animal hair to keep the cold out and the heat in. These materials were readily available and provided a surprisingly effective layer of insulation. Peasants would also use hay to stuff the cracks in the walls, preventing drafts from sneaking in. Peasants also understood the importance of layering. Their clothing was designed for survival, not fashion. Layers of wool and linen kept the cold at bay, with thick outer garments designed to protect them from snow and wind. They wore hats, scarves, mittens, and boots made of wool, leather, and fur to shield themselves from the elements. One popular garment was the surcoat, which was worn over other layers to add extra protection against the biting cold. Even when they ventured outside to tend to animals or gather firewood, peasants wore layers of protection. The act of layering was about more than just warmth, it was about mobility too. Peasants had to continue their work throughout the winter months, regardless of the cold, so their clothes were designed to allow for easy movement. This wasn't just about keeping warm while sitting at home, it was about surviving while working in the fields, tending to animals, and performing the chores necessary to keep their families alive. These practical garments helped them keep a level of mobility despite the bitter temperatures. At the heart of all this was an undeniable resourcefulness, something that medieval peasants were known for. Their ingenuity allowed them to thrive in conditions that might seem impossible for most people to endure. Through their understanding of natural materials, climate, and how heat worked, they developed a range of methods that kept them alive during the harshest winters. But these methods weren't just about physical survival, they were about understanding the deeper rhythms of nature, something that peasants had to do to survive. It's difficult to imagine how these simple yet effective techniques shaped their lives. What did it take to endure such a winter? How did they cope with the ever-present threat of the cold? As we dive deeper into the world of medieval winter survival, we'll uncover even more brilliant techniques that kept peasants going when everything else seemed to be working against them. But how did these methods evolve as winters grew even harsher? Could their cleverness keep them ahead of the ever-decreasing resources? As we continue, we'll explore how some of their most extreme survival methods weren't just about staying warm, they were about surviving winter's most brutal challenges. The winter months in medieval Europe were not just about enduring cold nights, they represented a long, drawn-out battle with nature itself. With little to no modern technology, peasants had to find ways to survive in a world where the weather could easily become their greatest enemy. The strategies and techniques they developed were as varied as the land itself. Each peasant, each village, adapted to their specific environment with a mix of creativity and necessity. It was a fight for survival that required not just knowledge of the weather, but also an intimate understanding of the natural world. Yet even when the basics of heating and shelter were covered, the battle didn't end there. What could one do when the cold wasn't just biting at the edges of your home, but was seeping into every crack, every corner of your life? Peasants knew that if they were to endure the harsh winter months, they had to go beyond simple warmth. They needed to address the fundamental issue of food preservation and fuel management, two factors that would either make or break their chances of surviving winter. Fuel was at the core of medieval survival. Without enough firewood, a peasant house would turn into an icebox, a place where even the most ingenious of heat-keeping tricks would fall short. For peasants, firewood wasn't just a luxury, it was an absolute necessity. The struggle wasn't just about keeping a fire going for heat, it was about preserving enough wood for cooking, heating water, and lighting the dark evenings. The trees that grew around them weren't just valuable for their wood, they were a source of life itself. But the problem of fuel was more complicated than simply gathering firewood in autumn and stacking it up for the winter. The types of wood mattered, the way it was chopped and stored mattered, and even how it was burned mattered. Many peasants understood that hardwood was far more effective than softwood. Oak, beech, and ash burned hotter and longer, providing steady, reliable warmth. Softwoods like pine and fir might burn quickly, but they created more smoke and didn't offer long-lasting heat. So, peasants would carefully select which trees to fell, ensuring that the best hardwoods were set aside for the coldest months. This wasn't just a matter of gathering wood, it was about selecting the right kind of fuel to get through the hardest part of the year. Once they had the right type of wood, the next step was storing it properly. Firewood needed to be seasoned, cut into logs, and left to dry for several months before being used. This process was crucial because wet wood didn't burn efficiently, wasting energy and creating more smoke. The process of seasoning wood was often a family affair. Everyone had a part to play, felling the trees, cutting them into manageable logs, and carefully stacking them in a way that allowed air to circulate, drying them out over time. The quality of the wood stacked in the corner of the house could determine whether the peasant had enough fuel to last through the winter. Those who ran out of wood during the dead of winter were forced to rely on more desperate measures. This is where the art of smoking came into play, a technique that allowed peasants to preserve their food and make use of the same fires they depended on for warmth. Smoking meat, fish, and even cheese wasn't just a way to add flavor, it was a means of survival. Without refrigeration, these preserved foods were essential for getting through months of cold. Smoking worked by drying out food while simultaneously imparting it with the distinct flavor of the smoke. Peasants would hang their salted meats, fish, or cheeses above the hearth, allowing the smoke from the fire to both dry and preserve them. Not only did this keep food from spoiling, but it also meant that there was always something to eat, even in the depths of winter. The technique of smoking also had an unexpected benefit. It helped keep pests at bay. Rodents and insects were always a concern during the colder months. Food stores had to be protected, and keeping food in the smoke-filled air of the hearth acted as a deterrent to any creatures looking for an easy meal. The smoke worked to preserve, but it also served a defensive purpose. However, even with the abundance of preserved food, there was always the concern of how to keep the household alive and well in the face of extended cold spells. The body's need for warmth was a constant struggle, but survival depended on more than just keeping the house warm. It relied on knowing how to maximize the body's ability to retain heat. Peasants discovered that certain types of clothing, especially fur-lined garments, helped keep the body from losing precious warmth. Fur wasn't just for the wealthy either. Peasants could gather fur from the animals they raised or hunted, and by stitching it into their coats, gloves, and boots, they created an insulating layer that protected them against the worst of the cold. It wasn't uncommon for peasants to add multiple layers to their clothing, each designed to serve a specific purpose in keeping warmth contained. For example, thick woolen undergarments were worn next to the skin to trap warmth close to the body, while the outer layer, often made from leather or fur, protected against the wind and snow. But it wasn't just about wearing more clothes. Medieval peasants were keenly aware that the position of the body was just as important as the layers they wore. As cold weather set in, peasants would often move in ways that kept their blood flowing and their bodies warmer. This meant that outdoor tasks were typically done in quick bursts. Instead of spending hours outside, peasants would perform chores like gathering firewood or tending to livestock in short, deliberate sessions, knowing that every minute exposed to the cold was another minute their bodies would be at risk. By far the most incredible feat in peasant winter survival, however, was the earth oven. This ingenious technique allowed peasants to bake bread and cook meals in an insulated, heat-retaining structure that could function for hours after a fire had been extinguished. Earth ovens were made by digging a pit in the ground and lining it with stones. A fire would be started inside the pit, and once the stones were sufficiently heated, the fire would be allowed to die down. Then, the food, usually bread or meat, would be placed inside and covered with hot stones. The heat from the stones would continue to cook the food for hours, providing a consistent cooking temperature without needing to stoke a fire. This method of cooking was especially valuable during the colder months because it used minimal wood while still providing warmth and nourishment. This wasn't just a clever cooking trick. It was a perfect example of how peasants maximized their resources. The same heat source that kept them alive during the day also helped them create their meals, demonstrating the deep connection they had with their environment. It wasn't about using one thing for a single purpose. It was about using every resource, every technique, and every scrap of knowledge available to stay alive. But even in the face of their ingenuity, medieval peasants faced an unavoidable truth. Not every winter could be survived. The cold, the darkness, the scarcity of food, it all took its toll. When the resources ran low, and when the fires dwindled to embers, some families faced the harshest decision of all: whether to stay in their homes and risk starvation, or to leave everything behind in search of food, warmth, and safety. But leaving their homes wasn't always an option, as many peasants didn't have the luxury of mobility. Their survival was tied to the land they worked, and leaving that land was often a last resort. So what happened when all their best efforts weren't enough? How did they make it? Through the darkest times? The answers lie in the resilience of these people. They had developed ingenious ways to not only survive the cold, but to rise above it, adapting as needed and refusing to give in. But what made their ingenuity so extraordinary was that it wasn't just about using what they had, it was about creating a system of survival that drew on community and tradition. And as harsh as winter could be, medieval peasants were a testament to what could be accomplished when necessity and the will to live drove them forward. But the real question remains, how did they adapt when the winters became even harsher, when the temperature dropped and the snow fell heavier and the resources began to run low? Would their brilliant survival strategies be enough, or would they be forced to face the unthinkable? As we dig deeper into the final part of this story, we will uncover the last, most desperate methods they used to survive those extreme winters, and how some of them became legends. As the long winters set in and the winds howled through the barren landscape, the medieval peasants' resilience was pushed to its very limits. Their survival had always been a delicate balance between the resources at hand and their ability to make the most of what they had. As the temperatures dropped and the harshness of the season became more intense, there was a constant push and pull between ingenuity and desperation. By the time the coldest months of winter arrived, survival strategies that once seemed effective began to feel increasingly inadequate. Yet, as history shows, these peasants didn't simply fade away. They adapted, they innovated, and most importantly, they survived. One of the most notable survival methods that came to the forefront as winter turned deadly was the practice of snow farming. While it might sound strange today, snow farming was an essential technique used by peasants living in the harshest northern climates. Snow was often seen as an enemy, a blanket of frost that covered the land and made every step feel like an uphill battle. But to the clever peasant, snow was just another tool to harness. Snow farming involved collecting snow in large makeshift trenches or snowbanks. Peasants would pack the snow down tightly, creating large blocks that could be stored and used for a variety of purposes. While this may seem like an odd approach, the snow, when properly compacted, acted as a form of insulation. Peasants would line their homes and storage sheds with snow to help protect the food and firewood inside from the cold. They learned that snow, when layered thick enough, created an almost airtight seal, keeping the cold air out and the warmth inside. But snow wasn't just used for insulation, it was also used as a cooling agent in warmer months. The ability to store snow allowed peasants to keep certain foods preserved well into the spring. Snow farming also had a crucial role in water storage. Water, essential for cooking, drinking, and cleaning, was often scarce in the winter months. Frozen lakes and rivers could be difficult to access, and even the water wells froze, making it impossible to draw fresh water. Peasants learned to use the snow they collected as an alternative to fresh water. By melting snow, they could create clean drinking water or use it for cooking and washing. Though it took a significant amount of time and energy to melt snow, it was a life-saving practice during the most extreme winters, especially in regions where freezing temperatures stretched over several months. This technique wasn't just a survival tactic, it was part of a broader understanding of how to leverage every available resource. But survival in the dead of winter wasn't just about managing heat and food. Peasants also had to contend with mobility. Snow and ice covered the ground, making travel treacherous. For peasants living in rural areas, even the smallest journey could become a deadly endeavor. The roads, if they existed at all, were often little more than tracks in the snow, and even these paths could become impassable in heavy snowfalls. But where there was a will, there was a way. Peasants began to rely on sleds and skis, tools that would become crucial to their survival. Sleds made from wood and sometimes reinforced with iron allowed peasants to transport firewood, food, and other essential supplies across the snow. They were designed for efficiency, able to slide smoothly over the snow, reducing the effort required to carry goods. But the most fascinating aspect of this technology wasn't just its practicality, it was how it connected peasants to their environment. The sleds allowed them to gather resources that would otherwise have been out of reach. They could harvest wood from forests deep within the snow, gather food from outlying areas, and even transport family members in the case of illness or injury. In some areas, peasants also used snowshoes, large, flat shoes that distributed their weight over a larger surface area. preventing them from sinking too deeply into the snow. These inventions were not just products of necessity, they were expressions of ingenuity that allowed peasants to overcome the most severe challenges winter threw at them. But not all winters could be survived with tools and techniques alone. As the seasons turned colder and food stores dwindled, medieval peasants found themselves facing a dilemma that had been present throughout their history: what to do when resources ran out. The most desperate of winters required the most extreme of measures, and it was during these times that peasants often resorted to scavenging. The art of scavenging wasn't just about searching for food, it was about finding value in every piece of the natural world, no matter how unappealing it might seem. Peasants had a deep knowledge of the land, and they knew how to extract value from everything. When hunting or farming couldn't provide enough food, peasants turned to the forest, fields, and even frozen lakes in search of sustenance. They would forage for wild plants, berries, roots, and edible herbs, many of which had been stored for use during the spring and summer months. More desperate times called for even more radical strategies. In some regions, peasants would hunt small game, including rabbits, squirrels, and even insects, which were often a last-ditch food source. It was an unfortunate truth that when food stores ran low and the cold had drained their energy, many peasants would resort to eating leather or the skin of animals they had previously hunted. Animal bones, too, were a valuable resource. Bones could be boiled down to create broth, which provided both warmth and nutrition, especially when food stores were depleted. Though it may sound unimaginable today, this was the reality for many peasants during particularly harsh winters. The ingenuity of these peasants was such that they could find value in the smallest of resources, something that would be lost on many in today's world. Yet even as they turned to scavenging, medieval peasants also had a spiritual and communal understanding of survival. Their survival in the winter months wasn't just about the body, it was about the mind and the community. Communities would come together during the cold months, sharing resources, food, and even warmth. In many villages, the harshness of winter led to greater social bonds. The poor shared what little they had, and neighbors helped one another as a matter of necessity. The tradition of shared hearths, where entire families or villages would gather around a central fire to eat, share stories, and keep warm, was a cultural practice that helped peasants endure the most difficult winters. As bleak as these winters were, the bond between peasants grew stronger during these times of trial. The communal support system was one of the key elements that allowed them to survive. They would even organize winter festivals, times of feasting, singing, and dancing to lift spirits and strengthen the community bond. These festivals were an escape from the harshness of winter, a time to come together and remind themselves that survival, though difficult, was a communal effort. When all else failed, there was one more survival tool that medieval peasants could rely on: their sheer will to survive. When food, heat, and even shelter became scarce, there was still one thing that could keep them going: hope. Hope that the cold would eventually pass, that spring would return, and that survival would lead to better days. It was this undying belief that no matter how dark the winter, life would find a way to go on. And that perhaps is the greatest testament to the medieval peasants' ingenuity and determination. In a time of crushing poverty, extreme weather, and limited resources, they found ways to not just survive, but to thrive. Their survival strategies, though born of necessity, are a testament to the creativity of human beings when faced with life and death situations. These peasants didn't just endure, they lived, they adapted, and they carved out a life amidst some of the harshest conditions imaginable. And while the methods they used may seem primitive to us now, they were incredibly sophisticated for their time. Every generation of peasants passed down their knowledge, refining techniques and sharing them with the next, ensuring that, despite the brutal winters, survival was always within reach. As we look back on their extraordinary resilience, we are reminded of the incredible capacity for ingenuity that resides in all of us. When faced with the coldest of winters, the most unbearable of conditions, the medieval peasants proved that survival wasn't just about the tools you had. It was about your ability to adapt, innovate, and hold on to hope. Even in the darkest of times, the light of human resilience always shines through.